Hi, my name is Chris Westbury. I'm a psychologist at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. This is a re-recording of a talk that I gave on December 6, 2024, in my department's cognitive seminar. I told a couple of people I would record it, so I'm recording it for them and for you if you would like to look at it. The reason I had to re-record it is, unfortunately, it was recorded in presenter mode, so it didn't really look very good. So let's hope this is a little better for you. The main point I want to make in this talk is to talk about why GPT models are more than stochastic parrots. So these generative pre-trained transformer models, or GPT models, have been around since 2017, but they're founded conceptually on some older ideas that I'll discuss in a second that I think are very helpful to understanding GPT models. Recent software advances, plus what is technically referred to as a metric fuckton of computation and text, have made these models very powerful, capable of feats that we would have a few years ago in ancient times thought required intelligence. Even though there's lots of evidence of their capabilities, and those capabilities have evolved with amazing rapidity, it's quite common to see GPT models dismissed as something like stochastic parrots or a blurry JPEG of the web or copy paste on steroids, or my favorite, money laundering copyrighted data, limited to parroting text that was in their input. In this talk, I mainly want to explain why people think that's so, why it's not so, and also to outline some evidence that suggests to me that these models may be psychologically relevant. If you're only interested in the GPT models and not in the psychology, I would think that you can probably jump to about 20 minutes, but I would stick around for the very beginning part where I talk about the roots of word embedding models, because I think it's helpful to understand those for understanding GPT models. So that's what I'm going to start out by talking about quite briefly. What is a word embedding model? Then I'll get into a little bit of psychology, talk about how language is related to human induction and why we're so much smarter than other apes. And then I'll get to the heart of the matter by talking about GPT models and why they aren't just stochastic parrots. So I started off apologizing to people because I was talking in my department where many people had heard me talk about Landau and May's 1997 paper, A Solution to Plato's Problem, many, many times. So that's why there's an apology there. This paper really did change my life. I read it. I was very interested in semantics, and I read it when I was working with the philosopher Dan Dennett as a postdoc. And as soon as I read it, I was like, okay, this is the approach we got to go with to semantics, largely for reasons that I'm going to talk about today, because it brought semantics into the realm of science, I think, in many ways. It allowed us to think about semantics in a kind of systematic way that did not pre-assume the existence of semantics, which is the important point. And I literally did change my life. I came out to Edmonton as a postdoc because someone here was working on these word embedding models, the early models, and I wanted to do that. And I have done that for most of my career now. So Landau and May's essential idea was pretty simple. They said, let's just keep track of how often each word co-occurs with every other word within some defined context. That context can be either a document, a sentence, or some number of words around each word, whatever you want. Consider it. Let's look at these very simple documents at the left there. I've got 3 documents that each have 5 words in them. They have a total of 4 words altogether, 4 distinct words. It's a little philosophical joke that I won't get into here. And on the right, I've just counted how often each of the 4 words occurs within each document. And you can see that that defines what we call a co-occurrence vector for each word in the language, in which each cell records how often that row's word occurred in that column's document. Models that represent words with vectors like this are referred to as word embedding models. By comparing co-occurrence vectors, you can get a quantitative principal measure of how similar 2 words are, which is one of the points that was made by Landau and May. You can see this intuitively here because our documents are so simple, right? If you look at the vectors for the words be and do that are colored in red there, that's 112 versus 113, very, very similar to each other, right? And it's easy to see that each one of those is more similar to each other than they are to the vector for the word to, which is 220. We could do the math, but if we did the math, it would just confirm what you probably can feel intuitively, that there is a more similarity between be and do than between be and to or do and to. Here's a very important point that I will come back to 3 times in this talk. Once for this model, once for the follow-up model to this model, and then again for GPT models. Note that I, who don't speak a word of Mandarin, could make a co-occurrence table in Mandarin because it's a purely mechanical process. It doesn't require you to understand the language. It's just symbol matching. After I'd done it, and it would be very tedious, of course, but if we had a very, very large corpus and many, many words of Mandarin, I could make a table similar to the one I just showed you. And after I'd done that, Mandarin speakers could use that table for semantic purposes. They could, for example, get a quantitative measure of how similar in meaning 2 words are. They could use it for valence calculation, something which has been done many times with these models. Or they could classify animals as mammals, or they could classify words for how funny they are, something I've done with these models. Or they could do whatever kind of semantic task a word embedding model enables, which is many. So the great thing, and the thing that excited me when I first read this paper, is LSA allowed us to go from a purely mechanical process that did not involve semantics to semantics. We went from a non-meaningful process to a meaningful outcome. In 2006, Google released a model that computed contextual similarity in a more sophisticated way than LSA. It uses a standard neural network with a single hidden layer, traditionally of length 300, but it doesn't have to be, that was trained to either predict a target word from that word's context or to predict a target word's context from that word. After training, the hidden layer is used as the word's vector, and those vectors are closely analogous to LSA vectors. It's harder to get your mind around what they're doing, but they're doing something quite similar in the sense that they're capturing the context in an abstract way. Here's a little cartoon showing you how word2vec works. So imagine that we have this very small 6-word corpus. The cat sat on the mat. We're at the word cat, and we want to try and predict the word sat, which is in its context. So we start off with a dictionary length 1 hot vector, which would have the word cat 1 hot. It says ants because I took this from somewhere else, but let's imagine it's cat. Then we would get the hidden layer for the vector for the word sat and try and predict the word sat from the word cat. And we would just use standard backpropagation to change the hidden layer using the error, which is the difference between the output layer and the input layer. So the word2vec is in fact trained to predict a word or all the words in a word's context, but they're predicted one by one. And notice that this is again a purely mechanical process that requires no linguistic understanding, that leads to something semantically interpretable. In theory, a person could do this by hand. It's very tedious, as you'll know if you've ever done backpropagation by hand, which I do when I talk about it in class. It's kind of painful to do it by hand, but in theory, a person could do it, and they wouldn't have to understand the language. So I could make a word2vec matrix, even though in Mandarin, even though I don't speak Mandarin. The important thing to understand about these word embedding vectors is they're not just arbitrary symbols of their vector label, or which is a word, right? It's not just like we had said, let's assign this vector to a variable like foobar, right? They're more like police sketches or oil paintings than they are like variables. They contain a lot of information about their vector label, about the word attached to the vector. And an important point that I'll come back to several times today is that this information isn't encoded in single vector values, but in patterns of multiple values. Here's an example to show you. Here I made 2 vectors by averaging the vectors for 100 mammals and for 100 birds. I standardized them and then filtered out anything that was within half a standard deviation of 0 just to make the picture a little nicer. And really, there's only 2 points I want to make. One is that both birds and mammals here are represented not by a single vector space, of course, because we only have 300 of them, but by many different vector spaces, many different vector values, and that they're different from each other, and that they're similar in some ways and different in others. We can't really see the similarity. We can't see if there's any overlap there because of the way it's graphed. But if we look at the beginning, we can see that there's similarity at the beginning where neither of the two vectors has much activity going on, and that's because those beginning vectors are spoken for other purposes. I've written a couple of papers about that I won't talk about today. So, okay, these vectors have a lot of information. What kind of information? Well, here's a cartoon showing that. This is a cartoon, obviously not a real vector, but a cartoon of the vector for the word dog, the word to vector for the word dog. And if you look at that vector, you can find its closest neighbors by just calculating its similarity to every vector in the dictionary. And if you do that, you'll find the closest neighbors include, for example, the words cat, canine, puppy, doggy, and veterinarian. So what's contained in those vectors is the kind of information that's shown here on the left. We can look at this vector and say, well, it's about something that can be loved, that's often a pet, that's like a cat, that sometimes has fleas, that is canine, that's also called doggy, that's furry, that's treated by a veterinarian. If you didn't know what I was talking about, you'd know what I was talking about, right? If you didn't know this was the vector for the word dog, and I gave you all this information, you go, oh, it's the vector for the word dog. This, of course, is a very small sample of the information that's contained in it. It contains much more information than what's showing here, including information about word class, word morphology, linguistic register, valence, and lots of other subtle information about semantic connotation and word use. So that's it. If you want to skip now the psychological stuff, skip ahead until you're about at 20 minutes, I think. I'm not sure where we are now because I forgot to turn the timer on, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how language is related to human induction and how it relates to intelligence. So Landauer and DeMay's paper was focused on the problem in the title of their paper. It was called A Solution to Plato's Problem. And Plato's problem is essentially how can we learn about something without sufficient exposure to that thing? In the dialogue, the Meno, Socrates asks his listeners to define the word virtue and then shows the silly people that every definition they give is circular, because it defines virtue in terms of itself or in terms of closely related concepts. And he says, how will you inquire into a thing when you're wholly ignorant of what it is, even if you happen to bump right into it? How will you know that it's the thing you didn't know? Good question. Noam Chomsky made Plato's problem famous in modern times because it inspired his famous poverty of the stimulus argument, which was raised in the context of discussing child language acquisition. Chomsky actually name-checked Plato's problem when he wrote about this. And Chomsky, as you probably know, believed that a child has far too little language experience to be able to account for her amazing language facility. He didn't really present any evidence for it. He basically just set it as a starting assumption, which is, I think, a problem. He also discussed whether we could hope the language would be related to other psychological functions, and he came down hard against the idea. He said, my own belief is that the principles of language do not generalize. They're in crucial respects specific to the language facility. I think these two assumptions that children don't get enough experience to understand language and that language is some kind of magical special thing that's different from everything else and not related to any other psychological functions set the study of language back by 50 years and basically wasted a whole generation of researchers who worked under assumptions that I think are not very good. And that's why I am representing Chomsky as a joker here. How did Landauer and DeMay talk about Plato's problem? Well, here's what they wrote. They said, a typical American seventh grader knows the meaning of 10 to 15 words today that she did not know yesterday. She must have acquired most of them as a result of reading because A, the majority of English words are used only in print. B, she already knew almost all the words she would have encountered in speech. And C, she learned less than one word by direct instruction. Studies of children reading grade school text find that about one word in every 20 paragraphs goes from wrong to right on a vocabulary test. The typical seventh grader would have read less than 50 paragraphs since yesterday, from which she should have learned less than 3 new words, not 10 to 15. Apparently, she mastered the meanings of many words that she did not encounter. How can this possibly happen? It sounds like magic when you first hear about it, and it was basically thought to be magic until Landauer and DeMay came along. They used latent semantic analysis to simulate the seventh grader situation computationally, and they showed that the model could learn words that it hadn't encountered, which they knew because they had control over the input, where learn words was operationalized as pick the correct synonym on a 4-choice, multiple choice question from the test of English as a foreign language. In the original paper, LSA got a passing grade of 64.4. May not sound very impressive, but it was passing grade, and it was impressive at the time, actually, because we didn't really have computational models who could solve even simple semantic problems like this, whatever it was, 25, 30 years ago. But anyway, GPT models now would get 100% on the test of English as a foreign language, no problem. Their solution to Plato's problem lay in induction, which, as you may know, is reasoning from observed particulars to generalities, as when we conclude incorrectly that all swans are white because every swan we've ever seen is white. This is a famous example from Bertrand Russell. We see swans, they're all white, so we conclude that all swans are white. In fact, there's black swans in New Zealand, if I remember correctly. Nevertheless, induction is really all we have, all animals have, right? Because all we have is observed particulars. So we're pretty much limited to induction for the most part. I mean, now humans have gone beyond that with deduction, but deduction is not very useful for day-to-day life. It can only be used in quite specialized situations, mostly in going about our day-to-day business, living our ordinary lives. We have to rely on induction, as do all embodied animals. Well, latent semantic analysis and other word embedding models induce semantic similarity, which is a general thing, from similarity of context, which is a observed particular. And Landauer and DeMay pointed out that the similarity of the context of two words will change every time we encounter either of the two words. So the similarity between two words can change after just one of the two words has been encountered. That's because we're just taking the difference between the vectors, or this calculating the similarity between the vectors. If one vector changes, then that similarity calculation is going to change, even if the other vector hasn't changed. So using second order co-occurrence in vector representations, we can learn things that we haven't encountered during the learning period. Most adult second language learners of a certain level will know this from experience. I learned French as an adult. I started studying it when I was a child, but I didn't really get any good at it. Well, I never got very good at it, but I didn't get much good at it until I was about 20. And I went through the exact experience I'm mentioning here, which is at a certain point, it becomes obvious that you don't have to look up words. When you first start learning a language, second language, when you're an adult, you have to keep looking up words. When you're reading, it's very annoying. But at a certain point, you pass a threshold, which most of us have also passed, of course, in our first language, where you don't bother to look up every single word because you know you're going to eventually induce the meaning of those unknown words. It's a big step forward when that happens because you've taken a new step towards mastery of the language. Landauer and DeMay made a fairly amazing claim in that paper. Well, at least it sounds like an amazing claim, but which must be true if high dimensional representation is true. Vector representation doesn't necessarily have to be a vector representation. The vectors are just a way of representing a high dimensional space. And this was the claim. They said the relation between any two representation depends not only on direct experience with them, but with everything else ever experienced. When you read that, you're like, what? That seems outrageous. But of course, if the relationship between any two vectors changes every time either vector changes, then the relationship between all vectors changes anytime one vector changes, right? Because any two vectors are just vectors that are taken from all vectors. So it's true that the relation between any two representations is going to depend not only on direct experience with them, but on everything else ever experienced if we take as an assumption that we're representing things in a very high dimensional space. Landauer and DeMay didn't discuss it explicitly in their paper, but implicitly their paper addresses what I think is one of the greatest mysteries of human language, which is how did we go from barking like wild dogs in the wilderness to reading James Joyce in just 300,000 years, which is the outside consensus estimate for how long we've had language. Probably we've had it for shorter than that, I would imagine. But that's the outside estimate. I think it's better to ask this question in a slightly more operationalized way, which is to say, what could prepare our brains by being almost language, but not quite? How could our brains have been approaching language before we had language? Well, Landauer and DeMay realized that their paper did answer this question in some ways because they did realize that induction using second order co-occurrence wasn't only relevant to language. Second order co-occurrence is co-occurrence of vectors or of context, because the vector is representing a context rather than direct co-occurrence of, for example, the words. And they talked about this in the paper. I was going to read this out, but it's kind of written in fancy language. So here's a way of saying what they said in simpler language. They said that second order co-occurrence offers a great way to understand messy experience. If you have many free dimensions, it's easy to model experience. You can learn more from experience plus its high dimensional model than you can learn from experience alone. So if we can get a high dimensional model going, we can start ramping up what we can learn from experience. So the answer to the question, what could prepare our brains for language, that's implicit in Landauer and Demay's paper, is improved induction. Right? What's almost language is improved induction using similarity of context rather than resemblance or contiguity in space or time, which is old-fashioned associationism. I think it's undeniable that being able to induce beyond experience would be a massive step forward for an animal and machine or a machine, because it frees that entity from the limitations of associationism, which confine us like other animals to what we can glean from our own limited direct perceptual experiences. There's a very nice example of this from the 1980s, which is a version of the matching to sample task. You probably all know the matching to sample task, at least if you're a psychologist. In the task, a participant sees one exemplar of thing, which in this case is the circle at the top there, and has to pick out another exemplar of that thing from a set, matching to the sample. Well, that's pretty easy to do, right? In fact, it's so easy to do that a pigeon can literally do it without any apparent effort, because it only requires matching perceptual form. Nothing could be much simpler than that. For many years, it was believed that there was a related cognitive test that separated us from our non-human primate cousins, which is conceptual matching to sample, illustrated here. It's very much the same idea, but you can see the problem. The problem is you can't solve this by associationist principles, because the relationship is not apparent in the perceptual forms of the stimuli. It's only in their relationship to each other. So you can probably solve this problem very easily. You can say, okay, the triangles are the same as the circles because there's two circles and there's two triangles, even though in their original form they didn't resemble each other in any way. That's why I had to make them all different colors, right? They shared no perceptual features at all. By the way, yeah, human children older than about 6 years have no problem with the conceptual matching to sample task. It's very easy for human beings to solve this task. But until the 1980s, no non-human primate of any age had ever been able to solve it. Well, in the 1980s, Premack reported for the first time that non-human primates had solved the conceptual matching to sample task. And he showed that his language-trained chimpanzees could solve it. I put language-trained in scare quotes because I'm not really convinced it was actually language. But they were trained on symbolic tasks. And it seemed natural at the time to assume that language training had made the animals more intelligent and thereby allowed them to jump across this previously insurmountable cognitive barrier. However, the actual explanation turned out to be more interesting. In 1997, a paper came out that showed that non-language trained chimpanzees could solve the conceptual matching sample task. The chimpanzees in that experiment had been taught to match a plastic chip shaped like a heart that indicated the correct choice in the conceptual matching to sample task. So it looked something like this, which obviously turns the conceptual matching to sample task back into the trivial matching to sample task. All you got to do is pick the one that has the red heart on top of it. And that's easy peasy, as I said. The interesting thing was, after training with that plastic chip and another one that was for the inverse relationship when the target pair was not two of a kind, the chimpanzees could generalize what they'd learned about same different relationships to solve the conceptual matching to sample task, even in the absence of plastic chips. But note that they'd never been explicitly trained on that task, right? They'd only been trained to select a red plastic heart that correlated perfectly, or a diamond-shaped plastic black diamond-shaped chip that correlated perfectly with the correct answer on that task. So it seemed that highlighting a tiny amount of relevant contextual information, basically marking perceptually distinct context as being the same, had made the stupid apes intelligent enough to jump over this intellectual barrier that had previously been thought to be unjumpable by anyone except us, wise guys, as I call human beings. Premack and Premack had previously argued that a piece of plastic became a word for an ape when the properties ascribed to it are not those of the plastic, but of the object it signifies. If you accept that definition, then the chimpanzees in the experiment had basically learned two words, one word for same, one word for difference, as a way of glossing over it. And afterwards, they didn't need the concrete symbols anymore. presumably because the learned word can serve as a portable context that can be projected onto the world to enrich the interpretation of any particular circumstance, much the way that we do when we look at the conceptual matching task and immediately pick out the abstract feature that we need to solve the problem. It's easy to imagine, I think, many extra linguistic benefits of being able to use similarity of context as a measure of similarity. I was going to say much more about this, but I ran out of time when I was putting this talk together. I mean, I ran out of time to talk, not time to put the talk together. But maybe the most obvious case is tool use. It's been quite heavily discussed. There's a whole literature on the relation between language and tools. This picture, as you probably recognize, is from 2001: A Space Odyssey, the beginning scene where the apes suddenly realize that a bone is not just a bone, but it can be used as a hammer or a weapon, and they start smashing up other things with great wild abandon. And the implication in the movie that is that this is the beginning of civilization, human civilization. You can see that seeing a thing as a tool requires us to override, or if you'd like, I think it's better to say enhance perception in the same way as the conceptual matching sample task does. You look at a thing and go, it's not just what it looks like, it's something else as well. So being able to induce using similarity of context frees an animal from the tyranny of mere appearance and thereby enables abstract thought. And it's very easy for me to imagine anyway, even though really we can only imagine because it's hard to know how we would prove this, that small incremental improvements in being able to induce would be incrementally adaptive over a very long period of time, potentially millions of years or many millions of years. So natural selection could have been honing the induction system that underlies language for much longer than language has existed. Okay, so if you've skipped over the psychology part, you're back now for the part where I start talking about GPT models. Those word embedding models that I've talked about so far have a lot of amazing semantic properties. I say trust me here because I've devoted my career to this. I've written lots of papers about what you can do with those matrices, but they're useless for getting computers to use language because they had no way of encoding word order or remembering or using local linguistic context. There were a few attempts to convolve word order in, but these didn't allow for the reconstruction or prediction of word order in any serious way. And they only kept an average context across all of language use, across some large corpus rather than a word's local context, which is what you need to be able to actually carry on a conversation, for example, to be able to chat. There'd also, many years earlier, been attempts to encode word order into neural networks using recurrent neural networks, which fed in a copy of the hidden units, which were called context units from the previous step. There's a little picture of it from Elman's paper, Jeff Elman's paper in 2009, showing the idea. Basically, you give the neural network a short-term memory, and Jeff Elman showed that they were able to simulate ordered language in a small, simple corpus of a few hundred words, but they didn't scale very well. They were basically just proof of concept toys, and they were too computationally demanding to be able to use for modeling language as a whole. They were just confined to this small toy language samples. Well, in 2017, Google researchers published a short, I would say too short paper, which was actually about language translation, called Attention is All You Need. And the paper has argued that we should trade in time, computation time for attention, and it introduced the generative pre-trained transformer to facilitate that trade. So you can see in the abstract, they say, we propose a new simple network architecture, the transformer, based entirely on attention mechanisms dispensing with recurrence and convolutions. Some guy on Reddit says, some friendly advice. The original paper, Attention is All You Need, does a horrible job explaining their model. If you're trying to understand how transformers work, you're better off looking at other resources. I have to second that. It's quite difficult to understand the paper, and there's some representational issues in the paper that make it unnecessarily difficult to figure out what's going on. So I agree. Yeah, you can glance over the paper, but I think you'll do better looking elsewhere. So what is a generative pre-trained transformer model? It's a neural network composed of multiple heads, as they're called, that are each composed of three parameter matrices: a query matrix, a key matrix, and a value matrix. I say the query matrix proposes, the key matrix disposes, and a value matrix composes. That's just me trying to be clever. Those are my own terms, not terms that are usually used. The matrices are all pre-trained linear transformers that work together to project the input matrix down to a lower dimensionality. The network is trained on predicting the next word in the input, which of course is what makes people think the models can only be stochastic parrots. Each head also includes a pre-trained multi-layer fully connected feed-forward network connecting that layer's output to the next layer. I should say that these images came from a YouTube channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown, which is absolutely fantastic and is by far the best explanation of GPT models that I've seen. And it has, I think, a series of 7 videos explaining them. The guy's a genius, and he's also extremely talented at making videos. So I strongly recommend you look at those if you want to learn more about how they work than what I'm about to tell you. So let me break down those 3 matrices. I said the query matrix proposes. And the reason I said that is because we can think of a query vector, one of the vectors from the query matrix, as asking a key vector. Here's what I think we should pay attention to. Do you agree? Both the query and the key matrices consist of vectors that are associated with words in the current input context, which in a chat would be the current conversation. And during processing, the query vectors for all the words in the current input context are compared with the key vectors for all the words in the current input context by calculating their similarity. So this query functions a bit like a search for relevant information about the words in the context. I'll have more to say about that in the next few slides. Of course, the model isn't explicitly searching for information or formulating explicit questions about aspects of the words. But the similarity between the query and key vectors are used as a weight on attention. Just as an aside, I think it would have been more accurate to call it relevance than attention, but AI researchers will also say these models hallucinate when in fact they confabulate. So they probably should have hired some psychologists before they started writing about all this stuff. Yeah, but in essence, what's going on here is the query vector gets an answer to a relevance query, a proposal about what's relevant that the query matrix is proposing by computing how well the vectors align with the key vectors, which allows the model to identify and weight relevant words within the current linguistic context. That's the important point. I said that the key matrix disposes, and the reason I said that is because it answers the queries that are posed by the query vector in just the way that I just said. A close match between a key vector and a query vector results in a strong attentional weight on the words that were matched. You might have the question, which I had for a long time, what makes the key vectors so smart? How do they know what's relevant? They're answering the question that's proposed by the query vector, but how do they know that? Well, the answer is that the key vector is able to respond to the query vector, disposing of its question or answering its question, just because the key matrix is trained to be more like the query vector. The key matrix is trained to be more like the query matrix, sorry, to the extent that that similarity helps the achieve the goal of selecting the next word in the input during training. So they're trained to provide answers that work, and that's why they do provide answers that work. So for example, in my go-to sentence, the cat sat on the mat, there would probably be a close relation between the words cat, sat, and mat than between any of those words and the words the and on. They would overweight the words cat, sat, and mat because the word the is kind of useless. It doesn't really distinguish very many things because it's so common, and on is only a little bit better. I said that the value matrix composes, and the reason I say that is the vectors in the value matrix carry this contextual information forward. The attention or relevance weights that are derived from the match between the query and key vectors are applied to the value matrix to produce context-adjusted word embedding vectors. These are word embedding vectors that are now being tuned to the specific conversational context in which they're appearing. So they start to contain information that transforms the initial static word embedding vectors, which is where they came from, into context-specific vectors that dynamically capture the current semantics. So I've shown a little table, which is really just a numeric version of this picture that I showed you on the previous slide, and I just made up these weights. I don't know if they're true or not. It's just showing you the same thing that we would weight mat, sat, and cat more highly than the and on. I think this is the sticking point for a lot of people in understanding GPT models, because it's really hard to get your mind around what's in these context adjusted vectors. So I'm going to try and give you what Dan Dennett would call an intuition pump. And I'm going to do that by saying that we can look at the word-to-vec vector for the sentence, the cat sat on the mat. The reason I stress the word sentence is, don't forget, the word-to-vec matrix is a matrix of words, not of sentences. But we can average the vectors in a sentence to get a vector for that sentence. So in this case, I just averaged the unweighted vectors for the word cat, sat, and mat. If I was smarter and I knew how to what the correct weights were, it would have been better to weight them, which is closer to what GPT models are doing. GPT models aren't doing this. They're not just averaging vectors, but they're doing something analogous in the sense that both averaging together vectors from a sentence and what GPT is doing that I'm about to tell you are trying to pinpoint a precise spot in semantic space that's most relevant to cats sitting on mats. So let's look at this cat, sat, mat vector. The words to the left are the closest neighbors for that vector that I made by averaging the three vectors for the word cat, the word sat, and the word mat. And I want to stress here something else that's very important for what we're about to understand. This vector looks like any other vector in the word-to-vec matrix, right? Even though it's composed of the vectors for three different words, when you average the vectors when you average three vectors, you get a vector, right? So it's not wrong or crazy. And in fact, I think it's helpful for understanding GPT models to think of this sentence vector as representing a word that doesn't actually exist. And if we do that, we can see that this non-existent word is in a location in semantic space. Not surprisingly, that's close to petness, madness, and ways of being on things, because those are the three vectors that we averaged. And it's easy to imagine that this could be a real word, right? It could refer to the feeling of seeing a beloved thing being quietly at peace on top of something. And we could name that feeling if we wanted to. I asked ChatGPT to come up with a name for it, and it suggested the word amorelia, from amor, meaning love or beloved, with a soft ending ilia that suggests a peaceful state. And here's some pictures of amorelia, right? And now we can use that word, that vector, as a word. Now we've given it a label. Before it was a sentence vector, now it's a word vector. That's what I mean, that you can represent sentences with a single vector, or you can put a lot of information into a vector, even though those vectors are originally thought of as representing words, individual words that already exist. So the query and key matrices are intended to fine tune and extend this kind of word vector representation of a bunch of words by enriching all of the word vectors to contain contextual information. So all of the word vectors in the context are updated so that they're more finely tuned to what we're actually talking about. They contain information about the answers to questions like this. Why is the cat sitting on the mat? Where did the cat come from? Why are we even talking or writing about a cat? What else is going on in this narrative context that's relevant to pinpointing where we should be? They're tightening and extending the context by finding that increasingly precise location in the massive universe of lexical semantics that's relevant to, in this case, cats sitting on mats. Here's a picture of what GPT-3 looks like. I'm going to focus on GPT-3 just because all the numbers are publicly known, but GPT-3 is quite far out of date now. In fact, it's now 3 generations out of date. It was 2 generations out of date when I wrote this slide only a few weeks ago. And numbers from later models are much larger, but it doesn't matter. For us to just get a basic idea, GPT-3 is fine. So every head, as I just explained, is a complex unit that does a lot of computation. It's made up of those 3 matrices plus the connectors at the end, the feed-forward network at the end of each. Well, a GPT model uses many heads. In GPT-3, there's 96 columns of heads. Each one is going to process a matrix that's of word vector length times context size height. In GPT-3, the context size, the number of words that you were allowed to have in the input or in the conversation, was 2048. It's much, much, much bigger now. In fact, Microsoft published a paper a couple of weeks ago saying that it's soon going to be infinite. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but it's certainly there's no conceptual reason why it can't be as large as we want. It's just computationally more complex to make that the input vector larger, longer. So we have 96 columns, 96 different heads, and each of those columns has 96 heads in it, 96 heads that are connected by these feed-forward networks. So those columns are processing the input independently in parallel, which is where we're trading time for attention. In other words, we're going to put the context through all 96 of these heads, and they're all going to go independently down each one of these columns of 96 heads, calculating away as they go through. So of course, this is why these models are so huge. GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters. GPT-4, which is now 2 generations out of date, had about 10 times more, 1.76 trillion parameters. They're really, really big models. And I just want to stress again that each one of these squares here is doing quite a bit of heavy computational lifting, right? Each one of them is an entire head in itself. And a head itself is already a complicated bit of computing. And now we've got that happening 96 by 96 times. That's 9,216 heads. Can't do the multiplication in your head. I couldn't remember what it was. Each one of those heads has its own independently trained query key and value matrices and its own feed-forward network too. And they're used to reduce the word embedding vectors of length 12,288 in GPT-3 to vectors of length 128. So here's an example. You have the word cat. You pull out its embedding vector, which is stored in the GPT model, send it through some linear transformers, and you get out 3 vectors of length 128, the query vector, the key vector, and the value vector for that word cat. And we do this for all of the words in the current context. After it's gone through all of those 96 columns, the final heads from all 96 columns are concatenated to make a matrix of length 96 by 128, because they're putting out vectors of length 128. There's 96 columns. And that gives us a vector of length 12,288, not surprisingly the same length as a word vector. That's obviously by design, because that's how the word vectors are actually trained to be. So we concatenate all those attention heads as shown in that first step that's circled there in red. Then we do some other stuff that I'm going to skip over. It's basically computational bookkeeping stuff. And then the final layer of the output matrix, which corresponds to the last word after adjusting it for the whole entire context, is projected onto the vocabulary to get the probabilities for each word as the next word. And then the next word is either chosen from that list the next word is chosen from that list either by choosing the most probable word or by choosing one word from among the n best matches if you want to shake things up a little bit. So it's the last word of the context that's used to pick the next word. When I first started trying to get my mind around these models, the first question I had is, what makes the heads different? Because a key power of these models is that every head is focusing on a different aspect of the input. So the model's getting a lot of different takes on the input text. You could argue it's 9,216 different takes because there's 9,216 different heads in GPT-3, or you could argue it's 96 different takes that are adjusted because each one of those columns is doing whatever it does, and it's not independent. They're not independent of each other. Anyway, there's a lot of different takes on the input text. That's the main important thing. How can we be sure that the heads are different? There's a bunch of reasons for it, of which the third one here is the most important one, I think. One is that the heads are all initialized randomly, and the second is that they're all independently trained. That's not really enough, because if there were some sort of main dimensions that could be pulled out, then the fact that they were all initialized randomly and independently trained might not be sufficient to make them different from each other, because they might all start picking up on the same main dimension of variance. The third one I think is more important. And during training, redundancy in the output, which would be different columns outputting similar vectors, would result in suboptimal performance because they would be accounting for shared variance rather than additional unique variance. So the training process naturally rewards diversity in the computations. As you're training these models, if they're doing the same thing over and over again, that's not as good as if they're doing something different. So we're trying to train them up to be as good as possible, and um, that is rewarding diversity in the computations, rewarding each column as picking up on some different aspect of the input. So what kind of aspects are they? This is a very Wittgensteinian question. And the only answer you can give to this very Wittgensteinian question is a very Wittgensteinian answer, which is aspects of many kinds. This is another reason both the language is hard to understand, as Wittgenstein wrote about at length in Philosophical Investigations in particular, but also why GPT models understand, because we're used to machines doing one thing, right? We're used to machines picking out one thing or performing one task. And in language, the tasks become so abstract that that kind of thinking doesn't work very well. Let me try and explain what I mean by that. So a few people have looked at this question, what aspects does the head focus on? There was a paper that came out in 2021 that analyzed a small model that had 16 heads. You pretty much have to focus on small models. I'll talk about real GPT, full-size GPT models in a second. But if you're going to ask these questions, what aspects do the heads focus on? You really have to focus on small models, because the full models are so complicated, it's hard to even know where you would go to get that kind of an answer. So in that paper, they identified several different patterns that were picked out by the heads, including, for example, sentences ending with a particular word, sentences having to do with the military, sentences having to do with TV shows, sentences having to do with time ranges, and sentences expressing part of relationships. The main thing I want to point out about these is they're very diverse and they seem ad hoc and minor, right? They're not like the main things. They're not saying they're picking up on the structure of the sentence in some syntactic way, or they're picking up on word class, although those things are also being picked up on. But when you look at them, you get these kind of weird micro semantic categories. Another paper that came out in 2022 tried to do the same thing. They devoted 25 pages to analyzing how a relatively simple GPT model with 26 columns of heads figured out the last word in the phrase, when Mary and John went to the store, John gave a drink to X. They found that most of the task was handled by 7 categories of output. It really was very difficult to do. It's worth reading the paper just because it's really a tour de force of reasoning and effort. But they were forced to admit at the end that despite the detailed analysis presented here, we still do not understand several components. Even these very simple, relatively simple models are really difficult for humans to understand. And the reason it's really difficult for humans to understand is we're kind of asking the wrong question when we ask what aspects do the heads focus on, because that final vector, which I'm going to call a super vector, that's the context adjusted vector of the final word. This is not a normal term. I'm just using it so we know what vector I'm talking about. That final super vector includes encodes, sorry, a massive amount of information. And any human interpretation of that information is bound to be an oversimplification, because any interpretation that didn't oversimplify wouldn't feel like an explanation at all to us. It would just feel like a total mystery, or just feel like a mess. And importantly, we have to get our minds around the idea that GPT models don't suffer from this human need to simplify, or if you like, classify the vectors. We're always like, what are they doing? Give me the name of the category that they're calculating. The GPT model would laugh at us for asking that question, if it could laugh, because it doesn't think that way. Think, in scare quotes. It doesn't have to figure out the categories. It takes the whole vector in at once and is pulling out a lot of information from that vector without needing to name the categories that information belongs to. There has been some recent work in auto-identifying human nameable semantic categories from GPT models, and that work has identified literally millions of features. That's not an exaggeration. And they include many micro semantic categories of the kind I just talked about, like words having to do with the Golden Gate Bridge, or words related to the Antichrist, and so on. Of course, there's many thousands, millions probably of such categories, but also some weirdo kinds of things, similar to the ones that I highlighted a few slides ago, like the word "the" at the beginning of the sentence, The specific phrases over the moon and land meets the eye, one feature for both. Sentences containing 4-digit numbers that specifically refer to a year. And my favorite one is the word right misspelled as RIHGT in Python code only. And also the word be specifically in the phrase want to be. So again, these really kind of weird, strange categories that to us don't seem like they are picking up the basic dimensions of semantics. We wouldn't think they were anyway. So why are these categories so strange and tightly focused? Well, the reason is because these vectors can encode a huge number of different dimensions. So in GPT, those vectors have a length, as I just told you, of 96 times 128, which is 12,288, but that's not their semantic dimensionality. It's not, of course, that they can only encode 12,288 semantic dimensions. That wouldn't get us very far because there's many millions of times more than 12,288 semantic dimensions. But because those semantic dimensions are encoded using multiple locations on the vector, as I showed you earlier when I talked about the word dog, we have many more semantic dimensions than locations on the vector. We don't know the full answer to how large the semantic dimensionality is, because it depends how many vector values are used on average per semantic dimension. But let's say it was 10 vector values per semantic dimension, which is surely way too low since we have 12,288 locations. Then we would have 10 to the 34th semantic dimensions. If they were using 100 vector values per semantic dimension, which I think is probably still way too low for vectors of that length, then we would have a semantic dimensionality of 10 to the 250th. And that almost certain underestimate is many orders of magnitude larger than the estimated number of atoms in the universe, which is 10 to the 80th. I actually think that the best estimate is probably the maximal estimate. I'm not saying this is the correct estimate. I'm saying it's probably closer than those two low estimates I just gave you. So the maximal estimate would be if they were using half the vector values per semantic dimension, 6,144 vectors per semantic dimension, in which case we would have 10 to the 3,696 dimensions, which is just a number that's vast beyond human comprehension. To even begin to understand what that number could possibly be, we would have to think of trillions of universes, each full of trillions of atoms, each of which encoded a semantic dimension. And a GPT model, importantly, has potential access to all of these dimensions at once, as I just explained a couple of slides ago. We have to classify them because we want to understand, and for us, understanding and classification go hand in hand. The GPT model does not have to do that. So what does this tell us about how GPT models are working? Well, the GPT model's proper function isn't really the mechanical process of predicting the next token that it happens to be trained on. That's why I started off by talking about word embedding models and how what they were doing was non-semantic, but what they led to was semantic. Its proper function really is to represent the evolving state of the conversation or any text, but I'm talking about chat here, with extreme precision by identifying its optimal point in semantic space and encoding that into the supervector, which is going to be used to choose the next word. So its proper function is really to use semantic information that it bootstraps from this purely mechanical process to construct the supervector that represents the contextualized semantics of the conversation. So it's a semantic representative, just as all word embedding models are, even though they were all trained to predict the next word. The GPT model's ability to predict the next words is kind of a side effect of its ability to compress the entire history of a conversation into that rich supervector, which contains enough information in itself to suggest what the next word should be. And this is why parrotism, though the parrotism criticism is wrong. There's nothing in the design of a GPT model that requires that the closest neighbor of a supervector has to have a label that actually did occur in the training corpus after that supervector's label. Of course, most of the time it is going to, just as it does for us. Most of the time we use words in ways that have been used before because that's the nature of language, but we don't have to. The machinery that's constructing the supervector doesn't know anything about how words are represented in their vector form in the sense that it doesn't have direct lookup access to anything about how those words are represented, at least words that are not in the input. So I think it's And then good analogy to think of a GPT model as a highly skilled factory worker who knows how to produce a perfect widget, which is a purely mechanical process, even though he doesn't know what that widget's for. Doing something complicated but mechanical without knowing what is going to be done with the final object that's being constructed. So the parrotism criticism really misses the most amazing strength of GPT models, which is they can communicate creatively and coherently, even if the conversation is about something that's not in their training corpus. It's actually easy to show this in a trivial sense by just asking it about a word that's not in its training corpus. So here I asked ChatGPT about an imaginary African animal called an Engliwara. And ChatGPT said, of course, I'd love to learn more about Engliwaras. What kind of habitat do Engliwaras prefer? What do Engliwaras eat? How do Engliwaras interact with their environment? Do Engliwaras have any unique behaviors? There's no surprise here because you and I would do exactly the same thing, right? It's no problem for us to go from an unknown word to knowing a lot about it because we know something about it from the context. Once we know it's an animal, well, we know a lot about animals, so we know a lot about an Engliwara, even if we've never heard the word before. Here's us maybe no, I skipped forward to the next slide there for a second. Yeah, I had to apologize to ChatGPT because I felt it was kind of rude to do this. So I said I just wanted to demonstrate that you could use words that weren't in your training corpus. And ChatGPT said, you're absolutely right. And it's a fascinating feature of how these models work. Even though Engliwara isn't a term in my training data, I can understand and work with it as if it's a known concept. By treating Engliwara like any other noun and relying on context clues, I can generate relevant questions or responses based on its implied characteristics. This is very similar to what I talked about earlier on with latent semantic analysis. The flexibility showcases one of the strengths of language models. They don't rely solely on memorized words, but can generalize and interpret new words by applying learned patterns and structures. It's a kind of creative adaptability that allows us to handle novel language in real time. ChatGPT for me uses a lot of exclamation marks. It's very excited. I think I've encouraged it to be that way, but here's a maybe slightly more convincing example if that one wasn't convincing to you. I asked ChatGPT to produce a sentence that's probably never been produced in English before, and it produced the sentence: in the luminous serendipity of kaleidoscopic dreams, effervescent unicorns pirouetted through the quantum tapestry of celestial marshmallow clouds. It also recognized that maybe it's wrong. Maybe that sentence has been produced before, but I think you and I will agree it probably hasn't been produced before. And not only has it not been produced before, probably most of those word pairs have never occurred after each other before in language. You know, celestial marshmallow is a very, very strange set of words to occur, although it's possible they've occurred a few times in that full history of English. The other thing I want to say about this parrotism criticism is in some ways it's right. Here's a blog post from a couple of years ago that says a machine learning researcher writes me in response to yesterday's post saying, I still think GPT-2, a model that's very far out of date now, is a brute force statistical pattern matcher which blends up the internet and gives us back a slightly unappetizing slurry of it when asked. I resisted the urge to answer, yeah, well, your mom is a brute force statistical pattern matcher which blends up the internet and gives you back a slightly unappetizing slurry of it when asked. But I think it would have been true. I think it would have been true too. We do parrot language back ourselves. So using that as a criticism against language models seems a little bit strange in some ways. I'm going to end by talking about some big questions. I'm going to say some things here that many people will disagree with. I'll just go with what I believe and you can go with what you believe. Of course, it's hard to answer this question. Are GPT models genuine thinkers? But I think they're better conceived of as genuine thinkers than they are as thought imitators, which is the general criticism that people are making when they say that they're stochastic parrots. Because GPT models, as I've tried to explain, are designed to dynamically adapt their own internal, complex, intricate, general, precise, meaning-driven constructions and adapt them to uncontrollable, unpredictable, potentially entirely novel input from the real world. That's almost the definition of thinking, I would say. Vygotsky wrote something relevant here almost a century ago when he said the meaning of a word represents such a close amalgam of thought and language that it's hard to tell whether it's a phenomenon of speech or a phenomenon of thought. And I think this is actually more important than it seems because one of the things that makes this question, are GPT models genuine thinkers, hard to answer. We think we know what thinking is, but we don't know what thinking is really, right? We don't have a good handle on what thinking is. So in a way, to say that they're not genuine thinkers because of some prejudice we have about neurons, human neurons, is really not a very strong argument for or against them thinking. We really don't have a good way to talk about this. And I think we should maybe start from the other end. And, okay, these models are thinking. What does that tell us about thought? The other general question I want to ask right about, which is equally controversial, is will GPT models take us to general artificial intelligence? This is also obviously hotly debated, and obviously I don't know the answer, but quite a few people on Reddit and me believe that GPT models or some close descendant are going to take us to general AI within the next 2 to 5 years. I think we're much closer than most people seem to realize. Maybe not you if you've decided to listen to this video, but lots of people that I know have never interacted with GPT models and they don't have any idea how good they're getting now. When I have those kinds of conversations with people, I often think about the old joke about the speaking dog, which has the punchline that the interesting thing is not that the dog can't speak well, it's that the dog can speak at all. People love to focus on the goofy errors and limits of GPT models, like it can't count the number of R's in strawberry, although I suspect that Donald Trump probably couldn't count the number of R's in strawberry either. But they skip over the model's successes. They just seem to downplay everything that it does and go, well, that doesn't require intelligence, which they've been doing all my life, by the way. When Deep Blue first became a chess champion in the 1980s, people said, well, I guess being a being a champion chess player actually doesn't require intelligence after all. Whatever a machine does, people say it doesn't require intelligence. It's getting to be a less tenable argument as time goes on because these models are doing so much that used to be a measure of intelligence. People just skip over that, and they also ignore the numerous goofy errors and limits of human beings. Human beings also lie and confabulate all the time. People are always saying things that aren't true. And it's not really fair to hold it against an intelligent model if you're not going to also hold it against intelligent beings. If GPT models are not intelligent because they sometimes make mistakes, then we're not intelligent either because we sometimes make mistakes. I recently told a friend of mine who's an AI skeptic, and by the way, has never looked at any of these models in any way, never interacted with them, that GPT models were now performing at a competitive level in solving math problems for high school. They place in the top 500 in the States, which is what's shown in the red rectangle. And his response was, well, that's not very impressive. I've met mathematicians. I apologize to any mathematicians who may be listening. But what kind of a response is that? We're just going to dismiss competitive level mathematical prowess as a sign of intelligence now? To me, that seems kind of crazy. I want to spend a little bit of time going over the three charts up here. I'm almost finished now, but I just want to point out a couple of things, and they all revolve around this, that these charts are showing the performance from GPT-4o, which came out on May 13th this year, 7 months ago. The second one is O1 Preview, which came out on September 12th, so whatever that is, 4 months ago, I guess. And the last one is showing O1, which just came out on December 5th, which was a few. Sorry, I'm running out of power here. How stupid of me. I didn't plug in my computer. Okay, I'm back. December 5th, which was just a few days ago. In fact, when I first started writing this talk, I had to put any day now. So this is the high school math competition. It's showing accuracy. 7 months ago, the models were performing at 13.4% accuracy. Now they're performing at 83.3% accuracy. Pretty good for 7 months. Let's look at this next one. This is showing a programming code, programming competition, and it's showing percentile rank. Well, 7 months ago, these models were performing in the 11th percentile, and now they're performing in the 89th percentile. Also, a very impressive amount of progress for just 7 months. And this last one is looking at PhD level science questions, a set of questions called GPQA Diamond. There are multiple choice questions, but I want to just show you some because they're very difficult multiple choice questions. People think, from university that multiple choice questions are kind of trivial, but I don't think these are trivial questions. They're very difficult. They're so difficult that you really cannot answer them if you're not an expert in the field. I mean, I cannot even understand any of these examples that I was showing here. I certainly would not be able to answer them, and I suspect that anyone who wasn't in the field of molecular biology, astrophysics, or quantum mechanics wouldn't really be able to understand them either. Well, the models started out at 56.1% accuracy on this, but now they're performing at around 78% accuracy, which is fairly impressive, but it's especially impressive because it's better than human experts. That's who are performing around 70%. But these human experts are performing in their own domain. The models are performing across domains. So it's more impressive than it looks. They're doing better across domains than human experts are doing with their own domains. And although it looks like I've got some fake data here, I took this from a different paper. They asked at one point human Googlers, they said human expert Googlers or expert human Googlers, which I thought was kind of funny because I don't really know what that means, to try and find the answers by Googling. They gave them a fair amount of time to do that. And those human Googlers were able to perform at an accuracy of 34%. So that's just there for people who say, well, they're just looking it up. It doesn't really make sense to say they're just looking it up because GPU models don't really have the ability to look things up in that normal sense that we think. But at least they didn't. Now they do have access to the web, and I'm not sure how they're doing that, but maybe they have access to Google itself. The main point is just that just Googling does not get you very far in answering these questions. Here's Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, weighing in. Of course, he's biased because he runs a AI company, but he says it's possible we'll have super intelligence in a few thousand days. It may take longer, but I'm confident we'll get there. So the next few years. And then goes on to say in 3 words, deep learning worked. In 15 words, deep learning worked, got particularly better with scale, and we dedicated increasing resources to it. And that's really it. Humanity discovered an algorithm that could really, truly learn any distribution of data, or really the underlying rules that produce any distribution of data, to a shocking degree of precision. The more compute, that's computer power, or computer cycles, and data that are available, the better it gets at helping people solve hard problems. I'm going to give the final word here to an AI Microsoft researcher named Sébastien Boubec. I call him very charming because he's very, very French. He has a very thick French accent. This is from a YouTube video, transcribed from that video, called Sparks of AGI, Early Experiments with GPT-4, which I recommend if you're interested in this. It's quite out of date now because GPT-4 is 7 months old, man. That's ancient. But at the time it came out 7 months ago, it was really, really impressive. We were kind of blown away by it, those of us who were following along, because it was really the first time that these GPT models started doing surprisingly difficult things. I thought, as one of the comments on YouTube says, this talk will be one for the history books. What a wild time to be alive. And I agree with that. There's also a paper called Sparks of AGI, which you can read 100 pages long and outlines several of the same things. Bubek was talking about that paper. And here's what he said on the YouTube video. Sorry. Beware of the trillion dimensional space. It's something which is very, very hard for us as human beings to grasp. There's a lot you can do with the trillion parameters. We shouldn't be thinking about these neural networks as learning a simple concept like Paris is the capital of France. It's doing much more, like learning operators. It's learning algorithms. It's not just retrieving information, not at all. It's built internal representations that allow it to reproduce the data it has seen succinctly. Yes, it was just trained to predict the next word, but what emerged out of this is a lot more than just a statistical pattern matched object. And with that, I will thank you for trading your time, your attention for time with me today. Goodbye.